Long ago, in the deep still waters of MacDonald Lake nestled within the vast Haliburton Forest and Wildlife Reserve of Ontario, Canada, a team of divers working on a submarine project stumbled upon something extraordinary. An ancient stone structure hidden 40 feet beneath the surface, a mysterious monument made of massive rocks, one of which pointed precisely south and balanced with curious symmetry that defied nature. And though some initially thought it to be a glacial erratic left behind by retreating ice ages, the perfectly cut edges and improbable balance led experts to suspect human hands had placed it there, perhaps as long as 10,000 years ago, far older than any known monument in the Americas, possibly rivaling even Europe's Stonehenge. And while geologists speculated it might have once sat by a river rich in lake trout that attracted ancient people, others wondered if it was a burial chamber, a ceremonial altar, or an ancient calendar like the medicine wheels found in the prairies. And as theories swirled, whispers grew of a prehistoric civilization lost to time, a people who mapped the stars and carved meaning into stone long before written history. And as researchers debated and divers continued to explore, it became clear that beneath the calm Canadian waters slept secrets as old as memory, waiting to be awoken by those who still believe that wonder lies not just in the stars above, but in the silent shadows below. A S-word of the mysterious underwater structure spread. A quiet excitement rippled through academic circles and dreamers alike, drawing a new generation of researchers, storytellers, and explorers to MacDonald Lake. And one summer, a young archaeologist named Elia, driven by childhood tales her grandfather once told her about ancient spirits who live beneath the lakes, joined the expedition with a belief that the stones held more than just historical value. They were keys to something lost, something waiting to speak again. And as she descended into the cold, blue depths, the light from her torch swept over the southern pointing stone, which now seemed less like a random alignment and more like a message, deliberate and defiant against time. And it was there, as she brushed away silt from the base, that she found the first carving, faint but unmistakable, a symbol resembling both a sun and an eye, surrounded by wave-like patterns that seemed to shimmer even in stillness. And when she surfaced and compared it to images found in the writings of Gordon Freeman and legends tied to Canada's Stonehenge, a startling connection emerged. For these same motifs had been seen at sites as distant as Kyrgyzstan's Issyk Lake, where divers had also found sun temples and ancient monastic ruins tied to the relics of saints, suggesting that a vast and interconnected civilization may have once spanned the globe, guided not by empires but by a shared reverence for the cosmos, the land, and the waters that carried them. And as Elia pieced together fragments from maps, carvings, and the forgotten corners of oral history, a theory emerged that long before our time, a people known by many names but remembered by none sailed the inland seas of what would become North America, using stone and starlight to mark their passage, leaving behind puzzles wrapped in silence. And as the winds shifted over the lake and the northern lights danced above, Elia knew that what they had found was not an end, but a beginning, the opening line of a story so old it had almost been erased, now whispering back through water, rock, and time, asking only to be heard. But as Elia delved deeper into the lake's mysteries, analyzing sonar scans and ancient star charts, she began to notice discrepancies, stone markers that didn't align with celestial events of the present day, as though they had been positioned for a sky that no longer existed. And the more she studied, the clearer it became that the southern pointing stone was not merely symbolic but a true directional marker, aligned not to Earth's magnetic south, but to a point far beyond the planet, a position in space now empty, but which, according to ancient sky maps, once held a star that had gone dark long before recorded history. And the implications chilled her more than the icy lake water ever could, for it meant the builders had not only mapped the heavens, but witnessed them change across epochs, tracking a cosmic cycle that no modern civilization had fully understood. And then, late one evening, as she replayed audio recordings captured by submersible drones, a pattern emerged, soft pulses, too rhythmic to be geological, too structured to be mere coincidence, echoing in frequencies just outside human speech. And when she ran the signal through software used to decode whale songs and encrypted transmissions, a low sequence unfolded, like an ancient chant, repeating every 27 minutes, containing phonetic clusters that resembled syllables found in proto-languages spread across continents. And that was when she knew. The stones were not simply memorials. They were transmitters, waiting for a time when someone would remember how to listen. And as the next dive approached, strange things began to happen at the research camp. Watches stopped working, birds avoided the shoreline, and one diver claimed to hear a voice beneath the waves whispering her name. But when they reviewed his footage, there was a brief frame, just a flicker, where something vast and humanoid loomed in the dark behind him, its eyes glowing faintly, staring not at the camera, but through it. And Elia, shaken yet unable to look away, finally understood that this was no lost city. They had uncovered a gate, and something on the other side had begun to wake. The next morning, a thick mist blanketed the lake, refusing to lift even as the sun climbed high above the mountains, and Elia, drawn by an unease she couldn't explain, ventured alone to the southern edge, where the black stone lay, now humming audibly, vibrating beneath her fingertips like a heartbeat out of sync with time itself. And though she tried to record it, every device malfunctioned, batteries drained instantly, memory cards corrupted, until finally, with no other option, she pressed her palm flat against the stone's cold surface, and in that moment, her vision collapsed inward, flooding with impossible images. Monolithic ruins under alien skies, oceans boiling beneath red suns, great vessels drifting through space like abandoned cathedrals, and always, always the voice, layered and ancient, whispering not in words but in memories that weren't hers, memories of something buried before language, before history, something that had once ruled from beneath the ice and stars. And when she came to, hours had passed, and the camp was in chaos. 2 researchers missing, the others silent and pale, unable to speak of what they'd seen or heard. And yet they all refused to go near the water now. Even the seasoned divers, especially after they found the missing pair's gear washed ashore, bone dry and reeking of iron, though no bodies were recovered. And Elia, still trembling from the vision, knew what she had to do. Not report the findings, not yet, but descend once more, alone, past the trench where the carved pillars ended and the darkness became absolute, because the pulse had changed frequency again, faster now, more urgent, and she couldn't ignore the growing certainty in her chest that the gate was responding to her, not as an intruder, but as a key. And deep below, beneath the weight of water and time, something waited with patient intelligence, not asleep but watching, remembering her across lifetimes, calling her by a name she didn't yet know how to pronounce. That night, as wind battered the walls of the base camp and the lake frothed under a moonless sky, Elia stood alone at the shore, clutching the ancient dive, gear modified for the trench's crushing depth, her mind still echoing with fragmented memories not her own, voices that weren't quite human, flashes of a city older than the ocean itself, towers built from glass that bled light, and roads paved with bone-pale metal humming in patterns of meaning she almost understood. And with every passing hour, the pulse from the black stone grew stronger, more rhythmic, synchronizing with her heartbeat until it no longer felt foreign but essential, as if her body had always known this signal and was only now remembering how to respond. So when the others finally slept, too exhausted or frightened to notice her slipping away, she slid into the freezing water, each breath steady as she descended past the shelf and down through the columned ruins, now swarming with tiny bioluminescent organisms that parted like a curtain as she moved through. And then, beyond the known map, she passed into a darkness so complete it felt solid, the world above vanishing entirely, and ahead, outlined in faint red, light like veins beneath translucent skin, was an archway etched with shifting runes, a gate she somehow knew would open only for her. And as she reached toward it, Her hand moved without command, as though compelled by a will both alien and intimate, and the stone responded with a deep vibration that passed through her bones and in her mind, unlocking not just memories, but identity. Not Elia the scientist, but Elia, the vessel, the one they had marked long before her birth, a carrier of a bloodline engineered to awaken the sealed corridor beyond. And as the gate yawned open, swallowing her in pale fire and silence, she did not resist, for in her heart now burned a single truth clearer than any science could offer. She had never been sent to study the anomaly. She had been summoned to return. Inside the gate, there was no water, only weightless silence and a corridor that stretched beyond sight, lined with walls that shimmered like polished obsidian and breathed with an invisible pulse that matched her own. And as Elia stepped forward, she realized she no longer needed her diving gear. The air, if it was air, filled her lungs with ease, and her skin, once chilled by the ocean, now radiated warmth, as though her body had adapted instantly to this alien environment, each cell responding to instructions long buried in her DNA. Strange symbols flickered along the walls, not written but alive, adjusting their glow and form as she passed, reacting to her presence with curiosity or recognition. And further ahead, the corridor opened into a vast chamber shaped like a perfect sphere, its surface covered in geometric patterns rotating in slow synchrony, at the center of which floated a crystalline structure the size of a cathedral, pulsing with light and whispering in a thousand voices at once, some ancient and slow, others rapid and sharp like insect clicks, each conveying one thing. They had been waiting for her to come home, and as she reached the edge of the platform overlooking the sphere, a bridge of hexagonal tiles unfolded beneath her feet with seamless precision, guiding her to the heart of the construct where a throne, not of power, but of function, rose from the floor, its form shifting to mirror her silhouette, inviting her to sit. And when she did, every wall and surface around her exploded with images not seen but felt. The drowning of continents, the fleeing of species across galaxies, the locking away of terrible knowledge too dangerous to leave unguarded, and the creation of a single failsafe, her bloodline, scattered through time, always drawn back to this place by instinct and dreams, because only one of their own could bear the burden of memory without breaking. And as the voices coalesced into clarity, they spoke not with words but with undeniable certainty. The seal was weakening, the forgotten was rising, and the world above, blind and loud in its denial, would not survive what lay beneath unless she accepted her purpose, not to study the deep, but to become it. The moment Elia accepted, the throne dissolved into her body, not as metal or stone, but as thought and inheritance, infusing her veins with luminous threads of knowledge older than the earth itself. And in that instant she knew the truth. The ocean was never just water. It was a living vault, a sentient boundary separating the surface from what had come before, and she, the last descendant of those who forged the gate, was both key and sentinel. Memories not her own surged through her, worlds spiraling into darkness, civilizations collapsing under the weight of their own hunger, and the first breach, a ripple that began when the seal cracked just slightly, long ago, calling predators from the dark between stars who fed not on flesh, but on fear, belief, and memory, twisting entire species into instruments of silence and ruin. And now, beneath the illusion of deep sea and tectonic stillness, those same entities stirred again, hungry for the warmth of minds, for the chaos of a world that had forgotten the cost of its own noise. Elia stood as the chamber darkened, the patterns along the walls stilling, waiting for her command. And she heard the last message of the architects echo in her bones. If the surface refused to remember, then it must be made to listen, not through war or terror, but through the return of the forgotten, the flooding of dreams with warnings, the rewriting of instinct, the slow turning of wonder into fear, until every human who looked into the sea felt the presence watching back. With a gesture, she summoned the map of fault lines across the world, points of entry and old channels left dormant, and chose one, the Mariana Rift, where the veil was thinnest, where the old ones whispered most clearly and with the full weight of her lineage now guiding her hands. She reached into the controls etched into the sphere's core and began the awakening sequence, not to open the gates fully, but just enough to let the memories rise like oil on water, thick and black and shimmering with the shape of things not yet returned but never truly gone. And as the gate behind her closed, sealing the world inside from the world above, Elia whispered not with her voice, but with the new language in her blood. Let them dream of the depths and remember what waits below. As Elia drifted into the conduit chamber, her mind fused with the ancestral algorithms woven into the throne's essence, and the world above began to ripple. The first tremors not of earth, but of psyche. Across continents, the seas grew inexplicably darker, not in color, but in feeling, as if their very presence pressed against the minds of those who wandered too close. Fishermen forgetting their nets mid-haul, children waking from water-filled nightmares, and old sailors weeping at the shorelines for reasons they could not name. Each pulse of the rift below, seeding ancient memory like spores into the collective unconscious, subtle at first, almost beautiful, like a song heard in a dream that you cannot quite recall, until cities with coastal roots began recording mass sleep disturbances, identical images drawn by strangers continents apart. A single eye submerged in the ocean's pupil, watching with infinite patience and grief. Elia watched it unfold not with satisfaction, but with a necessary sorrow. Hers was not a reign of vengeance, but of rebalancing, for what had been sealed below was not merely monster or myth, but memory itself, and humans, in forgetting the price of their ascent, had risked repeating the oldest mistake, arrogant disconnection. And so she wove into their dreams warnings crafted from their own pasts. Drowned temples, cities swallowed by waves, mouths speaking words of power lost to time. And above, the world's most sensitive machines began to twitch, seismographs with no earthquakes, sonar pings with no echoes, satellites registering deep thermal anomalies with no source. Until finally, in a chamber buried beneath the United Nations Oceanographic Division, an encrypted red alert blinked for the first time in human history. Subsurface cognitive interference detected, level Omega, and somewhere in the North Pacific. A research sub received a garbled transmission through 16 layers of salt water and magnetic noise, a single phrase looping in a dialect extinct for millennia, yet somehow understood by all aboard. She has remembered. Now you must too. The world's response was as fractured as the old texts had foretold. Some governments dismissed the anomalies as cyber-espionage, some as psychological warfare, while others, quieter and older, knew better, their scholars poring over forbidden tomes and silk-covered scrolls retrieved from vaults beneath their capital libraries, each page trembling with warnings not of destruction, but of return. Meanwhile, in a remote listening post off the Aleutian Trench, a lone operator named Nara caught a transmission that bypassed all encryption. 7 voices speaking simultaneously in a language she didn't know but understood completely, their tones melodic, pleading, filled with memory and command, repeating a single word that burned itself into the air around her. Reunite? Elia, deep within the throne's core, began to fracture, her body still, but her mind cascading through a network of root thoughts and forgotten structures, drifting past memories not her own, but those of the beings who first shaped the rift. Not gods, not demons, but sentient architects of pattern and pressure, who had woven language into stone and emotion into water. She felt their purpose, containment, not punishment, yet she also felt their sorrow, for they knew the time would come when the boundary would thin, when humanity's march toward the stars would forget the songs of the deep, and so they had left the rift not as a prison, but as a bridge hidden in the folds of tectonic sleep, waiting for someone who could both remember and bear the remembering. Now, as weather patterns spiraled beyond prediction and migratory animals gathered inexplicably along ancient ley lines, Eliah's voice echoed outward, not through sound, but through gravity itself, bending space like breath on glass, reaching those whose dreams had begun to change. Children drawing spiral glyphs on school desks, blind monks humming melodies they'd never heard, and old women waking from lifetimes of silence to speak one phrase in voices not their own. She walks the deep roads now, and in the Mariana Observatory, the ocean's pressure sensors detected an impossible fluctuation. The rift, silent for eons, had opened not wider, but inward, folding into itself like a tunnel carved through thought, and something, vast, aware, and patient, had begun to stir on the other side. Beneath the surface of the rift, where light surrendered and time distorted, Elia found herself no longer surrounded by water, but suspended in a medium both liquid and thought, a dense, humming presence that responded to her every breath and blink, a consciousness older than fear itself watching her through fractal layers of silence. The throne she had entered was gone, or perhaps it had never existed in a physical sense, only as a memory-shaped key, unlocking a vestibule between what was and what wanted to be again. And within this place, the architects, those immense minds woven from vibration and mineral, gathered like a council of dreams, their forms not seen but known, each syllable of their language stretching across millennia, telling Elia not what they were, but what they remembered being, custodians of reality's edge, guardians of fractures where creation wore thin. They did not speak in warnings, for they had no concept of threat, only equilibrium, but their sorrow was palpable, for it was not their prison that had broken. It was the will to listen in the species above, the forgetting of rhythm, the severing of ritual. And so they offered Elia not salvation, but inheritance, a choice to anchor the threshold before it collapsed inward forever, pulling what remained of her world into the recursive void from which the first thoughts had escaped. But anchoring meant fusion, and fusion meant surrender, not death, but dilution, becoming a symbol, a bridge, a final interface between humanity and the ancient logic pulsing beneath its feet. Above, storm fronts congealed into geometries impossible to map, and across the globe, instruments began registering negative sound, frequencies consumed rather than emitted, while the dreaming children now spoke in unison across continents, whispering in their sleep a single sentence. She is not gone. She is becoming the question we forgot to ask. And as Elia reached forward into the center of that presence, hand outstretched not in defiance, but in resonance, the rift sang. Not a scream, not a roar, but a welcome and reality. For a moment, trembled politely in the vastness of the rift's echo. Elia's form began to shift, the boundaries between her and the presence of the architects blurring, as if her own existence were being recalibrated by forces that had no concept of self, only of continuity. Time slowed, then sped, then fractured entirely. She felt both infinitely small and impossibly vast at once, a ripple of awareness across the infinite fabric of what could have been, and what was soon to be, if she chose to take on the mantle of the bridge. The architects, a symphony of minds pulsing through the fractured threads of forgotten history, guided her without words, but with an undeniable pull, gravity that was more than physical. It was a draw towards something ancient, primordial, a forgotten vow written in the bones of the earth, not in stone, but in feeling. Above the surface, the planet responded. Weather patterns that had once been erratic began to align, almost as if the planet itself were exhaling, releasing a tension that had existed long before humans had learned to track the stars or measure their own shadow. A calm before the storm, or perhaps the calm that was the storm. In the cities, people awoke, their dreams indistinct but all tied to the same pulse. A single word crossing languages and cultures alike: unite. And then, in the darkness of the deep sea, where the rift lay hidden beneath forgotten tides, Elia's consciousness expanded, not just across dimensions, but through them. She was no longer one, but a singularity of awareness, stretched between worlds, between the thoughts of the architects and the minds of all who had ever known the deep, the dark, the forgotten. Her choice now was clear: and yet it was impossible to grasp in its fullness. To anchor the rift, to let it collapse back into itself, sealing away the endless past, or to let it continue, to let the bridge extend outward, dissolving the final veil between humankind and what lay beyond, allowing all the forgotten to return, to coalesce into something new. And as she drifted through the currents of the ancient minds, she saw it, not as a vision, but as a reality unfolding before her, a new kind of awareness emerging, one that transcended the limitations of time, of language, of memory. Unity, not of being, but of understanding. And in that understanding, the balance would tip. The forces that had been waiting would no longer remain in their dormant state. They would awaken, but not as conquerors. They would awaken as equals, as custodians of this new world that was forming, not beneath the earth, but between the stars, as Elia's form began to dissolve into the space of the rift. Her final thoughts reached out to those she left behind, those who still believed in the separation of things, in the boundaries between realms. She whispered, in the last breath of her consciousness, a final message that would echo through the collective unconscious. The question you feared to ask, the answer you sought to avoid, is no longer yours to keep. The edge has dissolved, and in that dissolution, we are whole. And with that, the rift sang once more, not a welcome, not a command, but a promise that the cycle, the pattern, the very foundation of all things was shifting. The world above would never be the same. The world above, still unaware of the cosmic shift occurring beneath their feet, continued in its restless motion. People walked through their days, consumed by the ebb and flow of their lives, oblivious to the fabric of existence unraveling and reforming in ways they could not comprehend. But in the hidden places, in the forgotten corners where light never reached, something was stirring, an ancient and dormant energy awakened by the merging of Elia's consciousness with the architect, the heart of the rift, where time no longer obeyed the laws of the known world. Elia's presence lingered, no longer confined to a singular form, but now existing as a network, a web of consciousness that stretched into the depths of the earth and the vast expanse of the stars. Her thoughts rippled outward, touching those who were attuned to the old rhythms, those who had once whispered of the hidden places of the earth, those who had once been called seekers. Among them, a select few felt a stirring deep within. In ancient libraries long forgotten, dusty books that had not seen the light of day for centuries began to glow faintly. In the mountains, beneath the towering peaks, caves once sealed off from the world began to tremble, as though some long-forgotten memory was reawakening. People who had long ago given up their search for meaning suddenly found themselves with questions they could not ignore. And in a small, remote village on the edge of the world, a young woman named Lyra awoke from a dream that had not been her own, but one that carried the weight of thousands of lifetimes. Lyra had always been different. From a young age, she could sense the pulses of the earth, the subtle vibrations that most people ignored or dismissed as imagination. But now, those pulses had become stronger, more distinct. They guided her steps, leading her to places she had never seen, but somehow knew. Her heart beat in rhythm with the earth, and as she wandered deeper into the wilderness, she felt the presence of something ancient, something alive in the land itself. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Lyra reached a hidden valley where the land seemed to hum with an energy she could not explain. At the center of the valley, she found an ancient stone circle, long overgrown with moss and ivy, yet unmistakably crafted with purpose. As she stepped closer, the stones seemed to resonate, their surfaces glowing faintly in the twilight. Lyra's heart raced. She could feel it now. This was the place where the past and the future met. The air shimmered, and as if guided by some invisible hand, Lyra knelt at the center of the circle. Her fingers brushed against the weathered stone, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. In that instant, memories that were not her own flooded her mind. Visions of stars, of ancient civilizations, of beings who had once walked the earth and beyond, of a time when the world was not divided into what was known and unknown. A voice, both familiar and foreign, whispered in her ear. "You are the key," the voice said. "The bridge. The one who will awaken the sleeping world." Lyra's breath caught in her throat, but before she could respond, the ground beneath her shifted, and the stones began to glow with a brilliant light. The earth trembled, and the world seemed to fall away, leaving only the sound of her own heartbeat, now in perfect synchronization with the hum of the stones. Above, in the cities, in the everyday lives of those who had never felt the pulse of the earth, the sky darkened. A strange chill swept across the land, and those who looked up saw the stars flickering in patterns that had never been seen before. A sense of anticipation, a primal knowing, settled in the air like a storm waiting to break. As Lyra stood in the center of the stone circle, she understood. The past, the present, and the future were no longer separate. They were intertwined, bound together by the choices of those who had come before, and those who would come after. The awakening had begun, and soon, the world would be forced to confront what had been forgotten. Elia, once a singular consciousness, now pulsed through the very veins of the earth, her presence stretching across time and space. She was no longer just a bridge between the architects and humanity. She was the earth's heartbeat, its whisper in the dark, its guide through the veil. The cycle was complete, and yet it had only just begun. As the first light of dawn broke across the valley, Lyra stood alone in the center of the ancient stone circle, her heart still racing from the visions that had flooded her mind. The air was still, the world silent, as if holding its breath. The stones, now dimmed, had returned to their ancient slumber, but Lyra knew that the world had changed forever. She was no longer just a seeker. She was a part of something much greater. As the morning sun touched the earth, she felt the pull of destiny, a quiet whisper in her soul urging her forward. The cycle had been set in motion, and the awakening was just the beginning. With a final glance at the stones, she turned and walked into the horizon, where the mysteries of the past and the future waited to be discovered. The world would never be the same again.